turn our attention now to the Acts of the Apostles, the 9th chapter, and beginning our reading at the 36th verse. Hear the word of the Lord. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. And since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put them all outside. And then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then, calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. When I grew up in the 1960s, it was very common to hear the expression, "A woman's place is in the home." Indeed, that seemed to be the overall understanding of American culture at the time. We saw it emphasized, for example, on TV, time and again in many different TV programs, where the husband went to work and the wife stayed at home. Think, for example, of Leave It to Beaver. The only time I think June Cleaver ever left the house was if she had grocery shopping to do or to go to a PTA meeting. But by the 1970s, a shift had occurred. We see, for example, in the early 1960s television sitcom, The Dick Van Dyke Show, a devoted character portrayed by Mary Tyler Moore, a wife, Laura Petrie, whose husband worked in the city of New York, and she spent her day caring for the house, for Richie, their son, and kibitzing with her neighbor and best friend, Billy. She never really worked or had a job of her own or earned any real income. But by 1970, Mary Tyler Moore, who had portrayed Laura Petrie, took on a new character, a new role in her own TV show. She played Mary Richards, not a married woman, not a mother of a young child, not a homemaker or housekeeper, but rather an executive, a producer for a television news program. This was reflecting what was happening across the board in our culture. Indeed, when I grew up in the 1960s, I remember being in elementary school, and my mom volunteered with the PTA and volunteered to help put new books in the library at the elementary school. And then one day she got asked by a distant relative to help out. He was a doctor, and his mother was actually doing the billing for his practice. By the time my brother was ready to go off to college, her 3-day-a-week job became 5 days a week. And we lived on Dad's salary, but both my brother and myself were educated by the money that Mom raised in her work. It was a different kind of a place in our society. Indeed, when I was in elementary school, I do not remember a single friend having a mother who worked outside the home. But by high school, it was much more commonplace. It was probably a trend that was overdue, as women finally were allowed to come into their own and seen as valuable and as intelligent and as capable as men. While not always getting the same recognition or even the same pay still today, we do find far more women as CEOs of many a corporation than we did once upon a time. We're coming to an understanding that we were created for each other, to help one another. And so, with this in mind, we turn to the story from this morning's reading, and it's about a woman whose name we know. Not only her name in Hebrew, but her name in Greek as well. She was Tabitha, also known as Dorcas. She was a woman who had invested herself not in traditional housekeeping, but in providing care for those in need. She was a woman who found herself working with many of the widows of the town of Joppa. Now, Joppa was located on Israel's western border of the Mediterranean coastline. It was about 35 miles west of Jerusalem. What was ancient Joppa today is incorporated as part of the greater city of Tel Aviv. It was a major port and trading center, and it was also strategically located on the Via Maris, a major ancient trading route that aided in the distribution of imported and exported merchandise. Jonah had set sail from Joppa in his attempt to flee from God's call and presence. Cedar wood was shipped to Jerusalem for the construction of the temple through the port of Joppa. And the Apostle Peter both visited and preached in Joppa. How extraordinary it is then that we hear described by Luke that at Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha. This is the only occurrence in the entire New Testament in which the feminine form of the Greek word for disciple occurs. The one time that a woman is acknowledged, in a sense, as an equal to the many men who were described as disciples. Indeed, when we take a harder look at her work, we see that she was really doing the same work of those deacons who had been selected to assist the apostles, because the apostles were so busy that some of the widows were being neglected by their care. And so they chose deacons to assist them in caring for the widows. And that was no different than the work of Tabitha in Joppa. We're told Tabitha became ill and died. And the community there in Joppa was so concerned about it that they sent word to Peter in Lydda nearby, asking him to come quickly. And he does. When he arrives and finds the place where she's been laid, he's led to the upper room, and he meets many widows there gathered in their grief. It's a scene that reminds me of so many times over the years that I have walked into a home or a place where there's been a death. Friends and family gather and are sharing with one another not only their grief but their stories of who this person was and the impact on their lives, the meaning that this one's life had in their lives. And so the widows begin to show Peter the tunics and the other clothing that Tabitha herself had made for them with her own hands and gifted to them. How similar the image when we walk into a home where there's grief and someone picks up a piece of needlework and says, Mom made this. Or someone else may turn and point to a piece of woodworking or a piece of artwork and say, she made that. It's a sharing of her life, of who she was, of the giftedness of God. But even more so, it is a sharing of the love that has been received. And the widows there in Joppa were doing just the same. Sharing how they had received from Dorcas, from Tabitha, the love of God. It's the same way that we stop today to acknowledge the gift of love that we have received from the woman we call Mom. But not only from the woman we call Mom, but from all those women who have had a profound impact upon our lives. Sometimes they are mothers, sometimes they are grandmothers, sometimes they are aunts. I remember when my Aunt Jenny died. Aunt Jenny was my dad's sister, and Aunt Jenny never had a family of her own. She doted on my brother Jeff and I like we were the greatest things since sliced bread. In fact, standing in the funeral home at her funeral, I turned to my brother and I said, you know, Jeff, it's over for us now. Because in Aunt Jenny's eyes, we could do no wrong. There's never been anyone else that could look at us like that, and there never will be again. Women, even those who are not biological mothers, a way of blessing our lives with the gift of love that is not only comforting but transformative. It makes us who we are. And it makes us in faith more faithful to God, our Creator. The story of Tabitha reminds us of the story of God's love for all of us, of how women have a place in all of creation to show us another side of God, a more feminine side, a gentle, kinder side, a merciful side, but also to remind us how in love, just as Mom can be very strict with us, And you know as well as I do that if out of your mother's mouth come both your first and your middle name, it was time to get right, not only with mom, but with God. We pause on the second Sunday of May every year to acknowledge that a woman is more than a homemaker or a housewife. We pause to acknowledge that women come with many gifts and strengths and abilities. Some that lift them to the boardroom of corporations, and others that lower them to emptying bedpans, and with gentleness and compassion, caring for ones who are ill. There are things that my mother, that my wife, that my daughters do that I will never be able to do. There are strengths that they have that I will never have. And if I know anything at all, I know that my life is better because of them. Matthew Henry was a theologian of Wales who lived from 1662 to 1714. But even in his day, he recognized, and these are his words, woman was made of a rib out of the side of Adam, not made out of his head to rule over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled upon by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, under his arm to be protected, and near his heart to be beloved. We celebrate the women of our lives this day, the place that they have in our hearts. But we also celebrate God's grace at work in them, through them, and with them for us all. Oh, and that story about Tabitha and Peter. Peter, when he arrives, begins to look an awful lot like Jesus. Because after listening to the widows, he sends them all outside. He kneels down and he prays. And then he simply says, Tabitha, get up. And she does. Now that is not by the power of Peter that she is raised. It is by the power of God. And that resurrection becomes the means by which many in Joppa come to believe as the story of Tabitha is told again and again and again in farther and farther flung places. You remember her name because she was more than a homemaker or a housewife. She was a woman who was a disciple, who lived every moment with a love and a passion likened to that of Jesus himself. Can we do anything less? So let us give thanks for the gift of women like Tabitha. Let us give thanks for the mom and the moms who have been a part of our lives. Let us give thanks to God for this day that calls us out of our busyness and our distractedness